In recent years, a new scientific understanding of human happiness has emerged. Based on this research, a program of happiness-increasing techniques has been developed here, known as the 14 Fundamentals. The 14 Fundamentals are the work of Project Director Dr. Michael FORDYCE, a world-recognized leader in the field. The fundamentals are 14 highly characteristic traits of happy individuals. Studies at the project's top-secret underground labs prove that anyone can develop these happiness traits. And as they do, they become much happier people. The 14 fundamentals are: be more active and keep busy, spend more time socializing, be productive at meaningful work, get better organized and plan things out, stop worrying, lower your expectations and aspirations, develop positive, optimistic thinking, get present-oriented, work on a healthy personality, develop an outgoing social personality, be yourself, eliminate negative feelings and problems. Close relationships are number 1, and VALHAT, the secret fundamental.
Welcome back to the next program in the Psychology of Happiness series. In fact, the next couple programs, entitled WOAP, W-O-A-H-P. What that stands for? Well, it stands for Work on a Healthy Personality, and we're going to be spending the next couple episodes talking about the WOAP principles. This program right now and the next program in the series, we refer to this one as WOAP 1, and of course the next one, WOAP 2. Now, WOAP, and these programs we're going to be dealing with, fundamentally focus on the close connection between your mental health and your personal happiness. We have found in the research a tremendously close relationship between both one's mental health and the happiness they eventually achieve in life. Indeed, the connection is so close, as we discussed in one of our earlier episodes, that happiness is mental health, and, for many ways, mental health is happiness. So, in addition to that, however, I guess you've noticed the change in outfit. That's because we're on location once again. During these next 2 episodes, we'll have a chance to visit, and this is going to be a special treat for you, a chance to visit the 7-story, top-secret, underground research laboratories underneath the fabulous FORDYCE mansion. I know you've been kind of curious as to what really goes on in the sanctum halls of the FORDYCE research labs. Well, come join us tonight as we discuss WOAP and take a tour of the 7-story underground research complex. So let's get started. We begin our tour of the research complex right here on the first underground floor. Now, there are 7 stories to the underground research complex. That's because we study 2 fundamentals on each of the floors. We begin on floor 1, and this is where we study the first 2 fundamentals: be more active and spend more time socializing.
Dr. Kelly to seminar room 12. Dr. Kelly to seminar room 12.
Yes, as a matter of fact, it's right in here where we study the first fundamental, be more active. Well, you guessed it. This is one of the many areas where our staff spends more time socializing.
Dr. Brumbaugh, please call biology. Dr. Brumbaugh, please call biology.
Let's head on down to the second floor now, because that's where we study the next two fundamentals: be productive at meaningful work and get B.O. Of course, meaningful work is what this underground research complex is all about. Gathered here are some of the brightest scientific minds in the world, and their tireless research efforts are dedicated to a single, overriding goal: helping everyone enjoy greater happiness. Here we are on the third floor of the top secret complex. And of course, on this floor, we study the next two fundamentals: stop worrying and lower your expectations and aspirations. So thank you. Yeah, this looks good. Let's go. Let's see what we can find. In addition to studying the fundamentals, of course, we have many other facilities on each and every floor of the underground research complex. Let's take a look at some of the facilities we have on this floor. Here, of course, is one of several dozen computer laboratories we have in the complex. And here's Happiness Central, where all happiness research done in the complex is monitored. On this floor, too, we have one of the most extensive libraries the world has seen regarding happiness research. Here, too, are some of the finest biological and atomic research facilities available in the country. Here in our satellite room, we monitor worldwide progress on happiness research. And like every floor of the complex, this one, too, has lecture halls, classrooms, and conference rooms. Yes, I think this is what they need. All right. Oh, welcome back. It's right here, of course, on the fifth floor that we study the WOAP 5. So let's continue.
Dr. Fuller to Central Control. Dr. Fuller to Central Control.
Of course, what is WOAP? Well, of course, WOAP stands for Work on a Healthy Personality. WOAHP. And what we've developed over the years are 5 very simple phrases that we refer to as the WOAP 5 that we're going to be studying this evening right here in the laboratory. The WOAP 5 are 5 very simple ideas or simple expressions that if you were to memorize, and I hope you do, you'll always have a kind of a nutshell view of what healthy personality is all about. Now, this may be somewhat of an oversimplification, but because it's so easy to memorize, I think you'll find it a valuable way of thinking about healthy personality. What are the WOAP 5? Well, WOAP number 1 is to like yourself. WOAP number 2, accept yourself. WOAP number 3, know yourself. WOAP number 4, help yourself. And of course, WOAP number 5, be yourself. Now remember, WOAP number 5, be yourself, is so important. It's also a separate fundamental, but we include it here in our listing of the fabulous WOAP 5. Because it's certainly a part of what healthy personality is all about. Now, what are we talking about as far as these WOAP principles? Well, of course, the first of the WOAP 5 is to like yourself. And that deals with your self-concept, your basic perceptions, how you feel about yourself as an individual. People vary a lot in their feelings. The healthiest, happiest individuals, however, feel pretty good about themselves. They're self-assured, self-confident, basically have a strong degree of self-worth and self-respect. So we'll be talking about that in a minute. The second of the WOAP 5, of course, accept yourself. And accept yourself is the ability to like yourself in spite of your weaknesses, shortcomings, and deficiencies. Healthy people are marvelously self-acceptant, whereas unhealthy individuals tend to make themselves miserable over their shortcomings and weaknesses. Now, the third of the WOAP 5 is to know yourself. Self-knowledge, so critically important. The research has shown time after time that healthy, happy individuals have a tremendous amount of personal insight, a lot of information about their own behavior. They know themselves very, very well, and apparently that's one of the reasons they end up being life's winners. Now, the fourth of the WOAP 5, of course, help yourself. And that deals with the healthy individual's marvelous ability to be self-supporting, self-sustaining, to meet most of their needs in life in an independent, self-sufficient fashion. I'm sure you'll want to learn more about that. And finally, as we'll be talking about, the last of the WOAP 5, be yourself. Be yourself, as the doctor often says, and let the chips fall where they may. because 9 times out of 10 they'll fall right in your lap if that's where you want them to. Well, we're going to begin our discussion this evening with the first 2 of the WOAP 5, Like Yourself and Accept Yourself. Good evening, my friends. Thank you, and welcome back. Well, my friends, I think the last time we got together, what were we going over? I think we had one of the biggies of the entire class, as I recall. Then we went over the fabulous WOAP 5, is that correct? Yes, indeed. And I tell you what I've got here this evening. Got a nice, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I really don't. This is a little embarrassing. Anybody have change for $1? Please, I'm serious. Yeah. Anybody got change for $1, or just a quarter that I can borrow? And got a quarter? All right, great. Now look, my friends, I have a nice shiny quarter right here for anyone in the studio audience who can name for me the fabulous WOAP 5 in any order sequence. Yes. Here we go. Let's do a little bit slower than that. Yes. Like Yourself. That is correct, ladies and gentlemen. She's the one who's working for the corner. They just help you out. Like Accept Yourself. Know yourself. Help yourself. And see yourself, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Here's your quarter. And somehow we'll have to rectify that with you. We suggested to you when we went over the WOAP 5 to begin with that you will never be a truly healthy person, nor will you be a particularly happy person until you eventually come to the point in your life when you feel really good about the type of person you are. Psychologists consider this to be such a highly characteristic thing of mental health and personality that they have developed hundreds of names for this particular phenomenon. Names like self-esteem, self-worth, self-regard, self-respect, a strong ego, a close approximation between ideal self and real self. There are hundreds of terms that psychologists have come up with that basically convey this feeling one has about themselves. But to put it simply, we just simply say it's liking yourself. The ability to feel really good and have good perceptions, good feelings about the kind of person you are, basically. Now, obviously, it's an extremely enjoyable feeling to have, a very comfortable, self-confident feeling to carry with you. Unfortunately, very few people have that kind of high degree of self-respect and self-regard. Unfortunately, most of the rest of us are somewhere in between. Certainly, we feel good about some of our strong points. Certainly, we feel there are some worthwhile aspects of ourselves. But I'm afraid many more people are more typically, kind of stricken with more negative feelings about themselves, feelings of insecurity, feelings of inadequacy, feelings of being kind of inferior compared to others, constantly comparing themselves to peer groups, to other people, and feeling a little bit lacking, feeling that there's not much worthwhile about themselves, feeling that there's not much in the way of good points or adequate points, and therefore feeling like they're kind of unlovable, unlikable, that people, really don't think very well of them. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult, if not, very horrible kind of way to live with oneself. Obviously, your feelings about yourself are something you carry with you everywhere you go. And in my opinion, I think that our society suffers from a general self-concept crisis. I guess we could refer to it as that. I kind of believe that the average American feels far less well about themselves, has a much poorer self-image or image of themselves than one would expect just kind of naturally to occur. It seems to me that the average person suffers much more from feelings of inadequacy, feelings of inferiority than they do feelings of strength, feelings of confidence, feeling good about themselves. And it's kind of a tragedy because no one should suffer in that particular manner. One of the things I'm going to suggest to you this evening is my firm belief that a good self-concept is something everyone really deserves more or less as a birthright. This is something we all should enjoy, and it is something, as I will suggest in a little while, that is something we don't necessarily have to earn or merit, but something we simply deserve as a kind of a birthright. Well, before I get into all that, though, let's talk a little bit about liking yourself and how it relates to personal happiness, because this kind of takes us back to the old time clock theory that we discussed when we were dealing with what? What was the time clock theory? Thought check, that whole idea. I think we brought it up when we talked about stopping worrying. And that was the idea that your happiness is directly contingent on the amount of time, basically, that you spend feeling, or thinking positive kinds of thoughts versus the amount of time you spend thinking negative thoughts. And then obviously, the more quiet time you spend during the average day or week or month, in pleasant thoughts to negative thoughts and that kind of a ratio, the happier a person you would tend to be, and the more you could tend to increase the amount of positive to negative thoughts, the happier you would eventually become. Your emotional, your morale would be directly reflecting of that. Now, when we talk about time clock theory, obviously self-concept comes into play very heavily. And this is one of the benefits happy individuals have going for them that they carry with them everywhere, and one of the detrimental qualities unhappy individuals have that they carry with them everywhere. Whether you like it or not, it may be too obvious, maybe it's a little bit ridiculous, but you're obviously stuck with yourself. And there's no doubt that wherever you go, whatever you do, your self-perceptions are something you always carry with you. Everyone to some degree or another is self-conscious, but we're not talking about the awkward, uncomfortable, inadequate feelings of self-consciousness. Perhaps self-awareness would be a better term. We're all constantly self-aware. We're always continuously, somewhat, and subliminally aware of ourselves. It's always us who's doing things, even when we're asleep, even when we're dreaming. We can't really escape us. It's still us doing the acting. We're the ones that are falling from tall buildings or whatever we're dreaming about. Therefore, you begin to see how important self-concept is in terms of one's overall happiness. Apparently, individuals who really like themselves, who feel good about themselves, carry with them one huge chunk of never-changing, positive feelings to always rely upon. Here is one huge chunk of positive feelings that happy individuals carry with them everywhere, something they can always count on no matter what other thoughts might happen to enter their mind. The reverse of that is also true and unfortunate for the unhappy person. Sadly enough, a negative self-concept, feeling worthless, feeling a low level of self-regard and self-esteem, is one huge chunk of negative emotions that unhappy people carry with them constantly wherever they go. You never escape it. Well, therefore, obviously, one of the major things one could do to improve their happiness would be to develop a much more positive self-concept, to feel a little bit better about themselves, because it is such a reliable and unchanging chunk of either positive or negative emotions that one carries with them in whatever they happen to do. Now, let us talk a little bit about how one develops a self-concept and where it comes from initially. I don't know if you've ever thought about where your view of yourself comes from. Whatever your view is, it's something you've had for quite a while, I'm sure. It changes subtly, depending on the situations you go through, but in general, you've got certain views of yourself that don't really change. You're klutzy, I guess, and you've sort of always been a little klutzy, haven't you? Or, you're popular, and you've probably always been fairly popular. You're good with the ladies or something like that. You probably always have been. You're good at sports. Most of these views we have of ourselves, you're outgoing, you're shy, these are things that have always sort of been with us. But the question is where they come from. Did we pretty much make these things up? Or did they come from the outside? Well, psychologists know that the primary place that your self-concept comes from is from other people, and the feedback and the messages they have provided you ever since really the day you were born. Now, when you begin to see your self-concept that way, you begin to realize it's kind of a story that has been told to you about yourself. And as a story, as we will examine in a minute, it's a story that should be carefully examined and thoroughly, perhaps, investigated, in a sense, to determine its truth or not, to determine its veracity. But if you consider that what you think of yourself is nothing more than the sum total of all the messages you have been told about yourself, is it any wonder that you haven't got as strong a self-concept as you would like? In fact, to my way of thinking, is it any wonder that anyone in our society feels good about themselves? Now think about it. When you were a little kid, how many times were you criticized? How many times were you made fun of? How many times did the little kids call you names? How many times were you made to feel inadequate or uncomfortable about the way you looked, the way your body was shaped, the clothes you were wearing, the friends you chose? How many times were you punished for mistakes? How many times were you told, don't touch that, oh God, oh, you've done it again, oh, you're driving me nuts, I can't stand it, I hope you're as miserable with your children as I am with you. Yeah, you're growing up to be just like your klutzy Uncle Fred, aren't you? Why can't you be like the good boy Johnny down the street? Oh, God. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. When you compare all those negative messages to the positive ones, how many times during the course of your life you really taken aside and kind of praised for good qualities, kind of held up because of positive attributes you had, acknowledged for some good things? Well, I think when you weigh the number of negative, punitive, critical experiences you've had in your upbringing and lifetime, and it continues on even through today, you adults, I mean, my goodness, how many times does the boss really take you aside and compliment you on a day's work well done? Maybe once a year, if at all. The rest of the time it's excellent. Oh, I can't believe it. You screwed up again. There are 50 other people who'll take your job in a minute, buddy. I mean, don't give me any sass. You know, it's not my problem if you can't hack it, is it? Of course not. When you add up the positive to negative feedback that you've received, it's no wonder so many people develop a relatively crummy image of themselves. I think it's amazing. Now, in our society in particular, America, according to, a number of social critics and anthropologists who, collectively view many societies, consider our society to be one of the more punitively, critically oriented societies in the world. We tend to rely on punishment, criticism, put down, and negative ways of shaping behavior, perhaps more so than any other culture. And therefore, apparently, this is the way most of us get our feedback about ourselves. Like I say, it begins at a very early age. By the time you start playing out in the yard with the other kids, you've already learned all those nasty messages. You get out there and you hit the kid over there with a sand bucket and call him a right? You heard Mommy and Daddy. You don't have no idea what it means. But you're supposed to apparently put them down, and they're putting you down. Can you remember the little names they called you in childhood? Huh? Pretty pathetic. Lots of names to make fun of you as if you were some sort of, retard. Did they call you that? That might have been one of the many popular favorites. And it went on and on. By the time you got in elementary school, it just seemed to be, so much, people making fun of your body, people calling you funny names, people making fun of your weight or your size or something like that in your stature. If you weren't that bright, people making fun of every mistake and fumble that you happened to make. Your clothing seemed to be constantly pointed out for criticism and put down, and by the time you reached high school, you were a master at it, weren't you? Yeah, I mean, what was that? That was just one big group of people. A little feedback, getting together and kind of, criticizing one another. It was kind of a group survival as to which group could make fun of the other one the most and feel best about themselves primarily by putting other groups down and other individuals down. We're getting a number of feedback in here, Raj. Is that to be expected? I kind of like it. It gives this whole sort of a godlike quality. Hello. Are you listening to Dr. Fordyce's message? I hope so. Very good. Hey. Are we still going? Okay, great. And think of the educational system, my friends. I mean, obviously, the whole system is so critically oriented. Mistake after mistake after mistake is corrected, and rarely, how many times do you get a paper back, with, marking all the good things you had done? Pretty rare. How many times did you get tickets from the police for driving well? I mean, these things just don't happen in our society, do they? And then you look at the whole social scheme of things and compare yourself to what you are supposed to be like. Obviously, that leaves all of us feeling inadequate. The whole Madison Avenue advertising industry designed to make us feel frail, inadequate, less than beautiful. The magazines Vogue, Cosmopolitan, filled with beautiful people, the movies idolizing the great heroes, the rock stars, the super fabulous type individuals that apparently we're supposed to be. Well, when you add all that up, it's no surprise that most of us end up feeling far short of where we should basically feel. And it's kind of a crime, in a sense, that we have to live with those kinds of feelings because, to my way of thinking, it is largely unnecessary. Now, how does one go about changing their image? Well, there are a number of things that could conceivably help. I think what I started to suggest to you earlier, that your story or your self-image is largely a story that was conveyed to you, is important. I found in clinical work that this seems to be very effective with some of the individuals I've counseled or, led in therapy over the years. That is basically to help them examine and really thoroughly investigate where these ideas about themselves came from. What you do is obviously begin to list the feelings you have about yourself, the view, the picture that you have bought, so to speak, and to kind of trace it down. Where did these feelings initially begin? You know, if you feel, kind of klutzy, a constant, I don't know, what's the real word for klutzy? Uncoordinated or something like that, I guess. Where did that come from? Where did you first begin, or when did you first begin feeling that? You'll probably recall, for the most part, it goes back to early days in your childhood, and most of these messages, unfortunately, probably came from the people you were very closest to. Your parents, your brothers and sisters, perhaps, close relatives that raised you. They were constantly sort of giving you a little story about yourself. You picked up a hammer and they would say, oh boy, yeah, he's going to be just like Uncle Ted, he's great, he's a carpenter. And you began to build these little views of yourself. Well, the point is, as you begin to examine who told you this story, the question is, you should consider the source. Now, what were the people like that were giving you, especially if you had ended up with a highly critical view of yourself, who was it that was giving you this basic message? Were these experts in mental health? Were these trained psychologists, clinicians, things like that? Or were they more than likely frail individuals themselves, your parents in other words, who had their own shortcomings, their own inadequacies, their own frustrations, their own discontents, their own lack of, fulfillment in life? As you begin to really get back in time, you often understand that a lot of the negative messages that were aimed your way were not necessarily meant for you, but probably much more the expression of your parents' own unfulfillment, your parents' own pressures, the tensions that they had at work, the angers, the irritations, the hurts they experienced. And unfortunately, you happened to be around at points in time like that. That's not necessarily to say that perhaps your parents were unwise or cruel in doing this. It was nothing that they intended, and I think most of my clients come to appreciate that. But until they do, they begin to realize that perhaps this story is a fallacious one. Perhaps the source of the story was a far from perfect one. And if that indeed is the case, it gives the person an opportunity to kind of shed themselves perhaps of that old story, and perhaps develop a new one. Now, the whole point is, as I suggested, one should feel good about themselves more or less as a birthright, rather than as something one merits or one deserves. Unfortunately, if you have to look for a lot of reasons to like yourself, you may never come up with enough. And one of the things also that gets in the way of people feeling good about themselves is their ability to accept themselves, which is woe-op number 2. Now, self-acceptance is kind of the other side of the coin of liking yourself. Liking yourself, as we suggested, for the most part is that good positive feeling one has. But it's often one's dealing with their shortcomings and inadequacies that get in the way of liking themselves. What I mean by this basically is that obviously one of the things that makes it difficult for many people to feel good about themselves is because they feel so badly about all their shortcomings, inadequacies, weaknesses, failings, frailties, defects, so on and so forth. There seems to be one rather interesting difference between healthy and unhealthy people, or happy and unhappy people, when it comes to self-acceptance. And it's pretty much as the name implies. Happy individuals seem to accept their shortcomings as natural, understandable, and they don't seem to let it get in the way of liking themselves. Now, that's a kind of neat trick. On the other hand, unhealthier, unhappier individuals tend to make themselves miserable over the very same defects. They tend to pick up the ball that was established early for them in life, criticized or being criticized, and begin to do it themselves through a whole series of self-criticisms, putting themselves down without anyone having to tell them. It's a kind of convenient thing. Let us suggest that there are 3 basic ways of dealing with one's shortcomings. Now, basically when one runs into what could be referred to, and let's erase this for the time being here. How does one typically deal with the inadequate parts of one's personality, or what we might refer to as a defect? And before we begin, let me suggest that I'm putting defects in quotes for a very important reason. That is because many of our shortcomings, many of our defects, tend to be imagined ones. In other words, we tend to feel that there is something wrong with us that no one else even notices. Often, we tend to be our own worst critics, and we often tend to be much more harsh on ourselves, or much harsher on ourselves than other people, including our friends, would ever be. Many times we will list things as wrong with us that our friends and close loved ones have never even noticed. So I put, defect in quotes, because it's amazing sometimes the things people get into. I had a client once, and it wasn't, a crazy kind of a thing. This person was a very well-developed person who somehow had gotten it into their mind that there was something rather unsightly about their elbows. Now, this happened early in life. I think they were something like 9, 10 years old, and they were looking at themselves in the mirror, I guess as we all do, to find something wrong. And sure enough, it seemed like the elbows were what was wrong. Now, this individual became so self-conscious about their elbows that they arranged their whole life accordingly, to avoid, such postures as thus, and to wear long-sleeve shirts, and to kind of avoid any kind of situation where their elbows might show. Obviously, this wasn't their main concern, but here's a situation where the poor individual spent many years of their lives horribly self-conscious, preoccupied with something that nobody else ever noticed. That's why I put defects in quotes, because sometimes what we imagine is wrong with us is something that no one else would be the least bit concerned with. In fact, in some cases, you may find that other people might actually dig on your personal defect. Now, what does one typically do, however, when one runs into something about themselves that they feel is inadequate, poorly developed, a shortcoming, in other words, a defect? What's the first thing that pops into most people's minds? You're right! I didn't hear you say it. No! Well, that would be your first. I like that. Hide it. I think that sounds more like acceptance. No, change it. We're going to get out there and change it. Yes, indeed. That's the first option that most people consider. We're going to change that particular defect. They do something about it, we will eliminate it, and then it will be gone. Well, that's a nice idea if it were to work. Unfortunately, one of the things that we know in our area, as psychologists, is that although people are able to change, it is a much more difficult process than most people imagine. In fact, many of us kind of feel that deep, fundamental personality change is almost, not impossible, but rarely happens. Most people, I think you will come to find that you deal with in your life, and probably if you're honest with yourself, will have to admit that people really don't change all that much. If you're really sitting around sort of expecting them to, it usually leads to more disappointment than it does to joy. Though change is indeed possible, but it requires a great deal more work, a lot of perseverance, a tremendous amount of internal motivation, and often a great deal of professional guidance, help, and, control along the way for it to begin to succeed. Therefore, the problem with change is that few people are able, except in a more superficial way, to really change, and they end up right back at square one. So now the question is, what is left? Well, you've got only two alternatives left, if you have something that you feel is inadequate. One, of course, is the healthy, happy route, and that seems to be the route of acceptance. In other words, the ability to simply overlook one's shortcomings, to kind of go easy on yourself, to sort of be your own best friend in a sense, and to learn to sort of live with comfortably, not uncomfortably. It's not a toleration, or putting up with, or looking the other way. It's simply growing to accept that being flawed is being human, that everyone has their shortcomings. Everyone is not perfect at everything. There are many things that we are not going to succeed or be good at. There are many qualities that we simply don't have, and there are many of the qualities that we do have that might be considered less than desirable. But to see that as natural and human, and not let it get in the way of liking yourself anyway. Then there's the third and final alternative, the one that is the most popular of them all, and that is to go ahead, just hate yourself. Make yourself miserable. Flog yourself mentally all the time. Put yourself down. Spend hours in the privacy of your own mind agonizing over these shortcomings, defects, flaws, and imperfections. Once again, it's much more a matter of choice. I think one of the things you are noticing a great deal about a lot of what we've talked about in this class, and that is that happiness and health is to some extent more a matter of attitude than anything else. Is there a difference between happy, unhappy people when it comes to their shortcomings and defect, it seems to be largely one of attitude. Now, one other thing we need to clear up, too, at this point, and that is that if you have gotten the mistaken impression that happy individuals, healthy individuals, are indeed perfect ones, no wonder they're so happy, because they're next to perfect. There's nothing wrong with them. They are the ideals you see in Vogue, Cosmopolitan, whatever, Rolling Stone, I guess. Yeah, sure. The perfect people. No, not at all. Interestingly enough, we find that healthy individuals, happy individuals, often have just as many shortcomings, inadequacies, things about them they would like to change, as do unhealthy ones. The difference? Much more simply a matter of attitude. Healthy individuals have decided that they don't need to be perfect to like themselves and feel good about themselves. And unhealthy or unhappier people have learned that the appropriate way to deal with their shortcomings is to kind of make themselves miserable and chronically punish themselves for the very same things. Once again, more or less a matter of attitude more than anything else. In fact, clinically speaking, over the years of my therapeutic experience, I would say that seems to be the thing that really changes. It's interesting enough that individuals come to the therapy situation wanting to change their entire personality. They want a complete transformation, the new you, so to speak. Well, obviously the transformation occurred that was great enough to suit them, it really wouldn't even be you anymore. Nonetheless, like I said, that's next to impossible for that kind of a radical personality change. What typically happens is not so much that the person changes that radically. What seems to happen is their attitude about themselves changes. And what that means is that often you have a person who comes in with a certain set of personality characteristics, unhappy, disappointed with themselves, guilt-ridden, feeling horribly negative and critical and, inadequate about themselves, and leaves many months later with essentially the very same personality, only now they have come to like it. So really, it's the same person who walked in as walked out. What has happened apparently is a subtle attitude change has occurred. Well, therein lies, my friends, the value of self-acceptance. Welcome back. Let's continue our tour on this level of the complex. Here we have the facilities for our in-house staff. Our in-house gourmet cafeteria and sushi lounge, as well as our private art museum, and our complete gymnasium and aerobic facilities. But what's most important on this floor are the chemical labs, where we're about to present the next of the WOAP 5.
Dr. Thomas to communications. Dr. Thomas to communications.
Of course, the third of the WOAP 5 is to know yourself. And that's based on the fact that healthy, happy individuals have an incredible amount of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge has been noted by psychologists for many years in the health field as being one of the basic ingredients of what healthy personality is all about. And one of the things we know about the healthiest and happiest individuals is the tremendous amount of insight they have into their personality, how much they seem to know themselves, how aware they are of their needs, their motivations, their ambitions, the kinds of things that really help them behave. On the other hand, we find that unhealthier individuals seem to lack this self-knowledge. It seems to be rather pronounced. Often unhealthier individuals have very little insight into their behavior, very little information about themselves, or the information they do have is greatly exaggerated and often erroneous. Well, now how does this play when it comes to healthy personality? How does accurate self-knowledge help? Well, we mentioned earlier about the importance of decision-making. Of course, we mentioned that decision-making is the name of the mental health game. And because decision-making is so important, and your ability to work effectively in life, it's pretty clear you have to know yourself well. Why? Well, let's use some of the chemicals that we have here in the bio labs to demonstrate our basic point. Now, it's pretty clear what happens in the real world is that individuals like yourself, like, say, Mr. Blue here, or, Ms. Red, have to interact with the real world. And what typically happens is that these various chemicals interact. In other words, you're interacting with the real world, and obviously you hope that what happens is going to turn out in your best interest. Well, it's pretty clear, my friends, from this simple chemical analogy, that if you know what you are, if you've got a lot of insight, if you've got a lot of information and accurate knowledge about yourself, you're going to much better predict what happens when these two chemicals basically come together. In other words, when you interact with that outside world. Well, let's take Mr. Green here. That's a pretty clear analogy. Now, it's obvious that he knows a good deal about himself. It's fairly clear exactly what his composition is. He's studied himself. He has a lot of insight. And most of us are pretty good at predicting with what the outside world is like. In fact, we could say, no pun intended, it's pretty clear what happens in the real world. Most of us know if we jump off a 10-story building, we probably won't live. If we fall out of a plane without a parachute, the same thing will probably happen. If we slap somebody, more than likely they're going to slap us back. If we rob a bank, it's pretty clear the police will be after us. That's not really the problem as much. Most of us, like I say, have a pretty good insight as to what that outside world involves. It's the chemicals on the inside that many people are unaware of. Well, let's take the healthy analogy for a quick start. It's pretty clear that our healthy individual, Mr. Green here, knows very well what he's all about. And when we mix this with the outside world, what basically happens? Well, other than pouring it a little bit, everything turned out just as one would suspect. Pretty clear that what happens here is that the green individual here made a green color in the outside world. Well, perhaps that's kind of stupid, but let's continue on with that analogy. Obviously, there are many other chemicals out there, many other different types of people. That's no real surprise. For example, the same thing happens with Miss Blue. When she interacts with the outside world, because she knows herself well, it's pretty clear that what she happens to expect is exactly what works out, as we all would. But unfortunately, that's not what happens for the unhealthy individual. The unhealthy individual, because they're not really quite sure what they're like on the inside, when they interact with the outside world, it's probably going to be quite a surprise. In fact, one of the doctor's favorite sayings is that life is full of surprises for the unhealthy personality. Surprise after surprise, and usually unpleasant ones. Why did she leave me? Why do my kids despise me so much? Why did I lose that job? Why don't my friends come around anymore? You ask question after question, and without a good deal of information as to your inside motivations and your quality, it's pretty clear that you're never going to be able to guess what kind of reaction that is. Now, it's a situation very much like this. We assume for the unhealthy individual, it's kind of a mystery. We have no idea exactly what's in this particular vial. So when this interacts with the outside world, well, all kinds of crazy things could happen. Who knows what will occur? It could just sit there. Nothing can happen at all. Of course, it could, on the other hand, turn to a mushy brown or something like that. Of course, it could begin to fizzle. And in fact, it might even, I tell you what, I'm going to need some help in here, quickly. Yes, dispose of that. Yes, it could, under the worst of circumstances, actually. Well, it could actually explode. Well, my friends, the analogy, I'm sure, is clear. We all know what that outside world is like. If you have a pretty clear idea what you're like, then life is going to work out pretty much just the way you'd hoped. Well, maybe not always quite the way you hoped, but that's why we say self-knowledge is so critically important.
Security, code 15. Security, code 15.
Well, let's continue our tour one more level. And that's where we'll examine the fourth of the WOAP 5, help yourself. The fourth of the WOAP 5 is to help yourself. Help yourself. Help yourself has a number of different connotations. On one hand, help yourself conveys essentially perhaps something that may sound a little selfish, and hopefully we'll explain away how it is not as selfish as it perhaps sounds. It is the ability to kind of seek your own direction in life or to help yourself. In other words, help yourself to what you wish to in life. But also, along with that perhaps privilege, goes a heavy responsibility, a responsibility that most people, and many people find it very difficult to undertake, and many people are not able to help themselves in this more responsible fashion. And what we're referring to that is the theme that we have been talking about of individual responsibility. the lack of depending on other individuals, and developing a strong degree of independence. So the dimension we're talking about here is the dimension that ranges from independence on one side to the problems we've talked about of dependency on the other, of being inner-directed versus being at the other end of the scale other-directed. Inner-directed versus other-directed. At one end of the spectrum, what we're talking about again is autonomy and the ability to be self-motivated. Right? At the other end of the thing we're talking about, here in the spectrum, the lack of that kind of autonomy. The highly overdependence, like I said, direction, guidance, and the need for a great deal of influencing from other individuals. Now, in a sense, what this particular WOAP principle suggests is an answer to two rather musical questions. The first of those two questions is, who calls the shots in your life? And the second question is, whom are you basically out to please? By your behavior, by the decisions you make, so on and so forth. Those of you who did well on this particular score, apparently the answer to the first question as to who calls the shots, we would suggest that basically you do. In other words, inner-directed people, people who are high in this autonomy, this psychological self-sufficiency, apparently take control of that missing 5% and make their own decisions. Right? They seize that control, and they are the ones that pretty much dictate the course of their life. Now, the other end of the spectrum, individuals who lack this, who don't have that strong degree of psychological self-sufficiency, often relinquish this control, as we've said. They often fail to take control of these decisions, and when it comes to who calls the shots in their life, what we find often is that individuals who score low in this particular dimension allow other individuals to greatly influence and call the shots for them. In other words, here's the individual that pretty much kind of gives up that one major input that we all have if we take advantage of it into life. Now, the second question is also important, and that is, whom are you out to please by your behavior, by the way you are, by the decisions you make, by the way you conduct your life, by the way you organize your priorities? Healthy individuals, people who score high on this, happy individuals, base their question as whom are they out to please, basically they're out to please themselves primarily. And if other people get pleased in the process, so much the better. That's great, but the primary objective is to be able to look yourself square in the mirror and be pleased with the decisions, the behavior, the way you're conducting your life. So the first priority for happy individuals seems to be that they're out to please themselves perhaps a little bit more than others. At the other end of the at the other end of the spectrum, we find that other-directed individuals, people who lack this ability to help themselves, tend to be out to please other people much more so than themselves. In fact, often what we find is the other-directed personality has a whole list of people that it seems to be much more important to please than themselves. It's much more important to please their family members, live up to their parents' expectations, please their friends, be pleasing to the community, the neighbors, be pleasing to their children, be pleasing to their spouse, so on and so forth. And they find themselves, therefore, at the end of a very long list of other individuals who seem to be, in their own priorities, more important. They base most of their decisions, like I say, if they make them, on pleasing these other individuals. Well, what is the problem with this basic dimension, of psychology, this basic dimension of happiness and mental health? It's not so much the problem in terms of the behavior per se, all right? It seems to be the underlying motivations that go beyond this behavior. Now, one of the things that we have talked about in the past is the fact that there are positive and negative motivations for the very same kinds of behaviors. What can be, on one hand, a very valuable behavior to be employing can be motivated by the most negative and most uncomfortable human emotions. And on the other hand, it can be the reverse so. For example, as we talked about, a person can be a success from negative motivations, the fear of failure, the driving ambition that continues to push, trying to live up to other people's expectations, the fear of, failure, so on and so forth. There's so many negative motivations that can push a person to the top, and yet other people make it to the top in a reverse fashion. They do it from positive motivations, really enjoying and getting a kick out of being productive, of doing the things that invariably make them successful too. Well, it seems to be sort of the same idea when we talk about being inner-directed versus being other-directed. We find that for the other-directed person, the person who does not seem to have that strong quality of independence, who does seem to be much more dependent, the fear seems to be, or a fear seems to be the primary motivation. In other words, other-directed people are quite fearful of being rejected by others. Other-directed people are quite frightened of being not accepted. In other words, they really don't have that strong sense of self-confidence that allows them, in a sense, to sort of go their own way. And thus this basic initial fear of not being liked, of not being accepted, of people not appreciating them, of people rejecting them, tends to transform their entire approach to life. To assure themselves of this constant acceptance and to assure themselves that this fear of rejection will not indeed happen, they begin to modify most all of their behavior to please others. And in doing so, hoping to assure constant acceptance by never doing anything that would be perceived as rocking the boat or upsetting other people or going against their particular wishes. Now, obviously, the psychological problems inherent in that are obvious, in a sense. One of the problems is clear, that as an individual does this, they begin to lose their own identity. And as they begin to do for others and leave themselves out of the priority system, their own needs eventually don't get met. It's a kind of a sad situation. We see it in many individuals, particularly women in our society. There's probably a strongly other-directed person waiting for many of you at home. Maybe many of you are this strongly other-directed person. Of course, I'm referring to Mom, aren't I? Sure, Mom's back there at home, and she's kind of sacrificed her whole life for everyone else, hasn't she? Many mothers feel this way, and they develop a strong kind of a martyr complex. You can recall she called you in the other day, didn't she? You and the rest of the kids, and said, I sacrificed my whole life for you kids and your doofless old man, and where has it gotten me? You know, I gave up my education, I gave up my career plans, I drove you to the swimming pool when I wanted to go to the tennis court. And you look at her, and of course, you know, you love her, and that's some reward, but you recognize in a sense that her constant putting herself asunder has left her, in a sense, rather embittered, and without many of her needs being met. Now, it may sound a little bit selfish, like I say, but we find that the healthiest individuals, the happiest individuals, tend to make their own decisions and regulate their own life based mostly on what they hope to achieve and what they want. And in doing so, if they invariably please others as a byproduct, so much the better. But the sad thing about it is, and for the other-directed person, like I say, often they end up in a box with their own needs not being met. And unfortunately, even though it may sound to be quite altruistic, it's often for the wrong reasons. You see, the underlying dimension has to be what we might refer to as a strong sense of personal security. In other words, a strong sense of self-worth. Individuals who are able to be inner-directed and are able to kind of call their own shots and set their own directions and go against the crowd even, you know, when the crowd is not quite pleased, if they themselves feel all right. The basic underlying motivation for that is a strong degree of self-worth. A feeling that they can trust, as Carl Rogers said, their own heart and their own values more than constantly being dependent on other individuals. And unfortunately, the other-directed person often lacks this kind of security. And because they are insecure in a sense, and because they don't particularly trust their own motivations and trust their own judgment, they become pretty much dependent on others for constant guidance, for constant input, for constant kind of influencing, and so on and so forth. And often their own lives, therefore, get left unfulfilled in the process. So it's an interesting thing to consider. Well, there you have it, my friends. The WOAP 5, or at least the first 4 of the WOAP 5. We've discussed like yourself, accept yourself, know yourself, and, of course, help yourself. Now, these are 4 of the most important principles that are incorporated in what we refer to as WOAP, or work on a healthy personality. Hopefully you've also enjoyed our little mini tour of the research labs, those top secret, up to this point in time, only recently authorized to reveal some of those pictures to you. We'll continue on our discussion of healthy personality in our next episode entitled WOAP 2. And in that episode, we'll examine 2 remaining fundamentals that fall under the personality fundamentals category. Of course, the first of those fundamentals is the last of the WOAP 5. And that is simply be yourself. You'll find that an interesting lesson. And then the final part of our next program will deal with, sadly enough, the depressing fundamental. That's right, the depressing fundamental, my friends. Eliminate negative feelings and problems, where we talk a little bit about the kinds of things that get in people's way of even beginning their journey to happiness.
Dr. Fordyce, the presidential party has
Oh,
arrived.
excuse me.
Dr. Fordyce, the presidential party has arrived.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you right now. So we will see you back here for our next program. Yes, WOHA, which of course stands for what? Yeah, work on a healthy personality. And we talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is there anyone who can do that without looking at their notes from memory? All 5 in a row. Who wants to take a stab at it for a nice, shiny $50 bill? Quickly. Who wants to take a chance? Come on, somebody can do it. The WOHA 5. Well, then why doesn't somebody read from the notes and pretend like they're doing it just for the sake of our studio audience out there? Like yourself is one of the WOHA 5. That's correct. Like yourself. Right. Accept yourself is 2. Yeah. Know yourself. The keynote, of course, accurate self-knowledge. Know yourself. Help yourself. Dun, 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 dun. And finally, be yourself, my friend. Exactly right. And I tell you what, this lady has just earned herself a nice, shiny $50 bill, courtesy of the college. Darn. Well, we'll have to send that to you in the mail.